Somnium, the Dream. In the year 1608, there was a vehement dispute between Emperor Rudolf and his brother Archduke Matthias, whose actions, in the opinion of many, were reminiscent of old precedents in the history of Bohemia. Motivated by keen interest among the public, I read about Bohemia and came across the story of Libussa, a heroine known for her magical abilities. One night, after gazing at the stars and the moon, I went to bed and fell into a deep sleep. In it seemed that I was reading a book of the fair. This book read as follows. My name is Duracotus, and I hail from Iceland, a country known by the ancients as Thule. My mother's name was Fjoxhilda, and her recent death has freed me to write as I've always desired. When she was alive, my mother tirelessly sought to stop me from writing. She saw the arts as filled with phonies who maliciously vitiate what their minds are unable to understand, and so build pernicious laws for humanity. There are many who, condemned by these laws, have perished in the abysses of Hecla. Although she never mentioned him by name, my mother told me that he was a fisherman who died at the ripe old age of 150 when I was 3, in the 70th year of their marriage. In my early childhood, my mother used to take me by the hand, and sometimes on her shoulders, to the slopes of Mount Hecla. We took these trips in particular around St. John's Day, when the sun is visible for 24 hours, and there is no night. After collecting some herbs and practising her rites, she used to cook them at home. Then she filled small bags of goatskin and transported them to a nearby port to sell them to the captains of the ships. Thus, she earned her living and mine. On one occasion, out of pure curiosity, I cut a bag to see what was inside. My unsuspecting mother was about to sell it when the herbs and some fabrics embroidered with various symbols fell out. As I had deprived her of our source of income, I, rather than the bag, became property of the captain, and so she kept her money. The next day, the captain set sail by surprise, with favorable winds turned to Bergen and Norway. Within a few days, the north wind rose, and the captain directed the boat towards Denmark, sailing between Norway and England, as he had to deliver a letter from an Icelandic bishop to the Dane Tycho Brahe, who lived on the island of Ven. The swaying of the ship and the unusual warmth in the air made me sick, since I was just a 14-year-old lad. When the ship reached the shore, the captain put me and the letter in the hands of a fisherman from the island, and, after expressing his desire to return, he set sail again. As soon as I gave Brahe the letter, he became very happy and started asking me a number of questions, which I didn't understand since I did not speak his language, apart from a few words. Accordingly, he instructed his students, who he sustained in large numbers, to mingle with me. Thus, thanks to the generosity of Brahe and a few weeks of practice, I began to speak Danish tolerably well. I was prepared to speak no less than they were to ask, since I wondered about many unusual things, and they questioned me about the news that I told them about my country. Finally, the captain returned to pick me up. However, Brahe did not allow him, which made me extremely happy. At that time, I indulged in astronomical pursuits to an extraordinary extent. At night, Brahe and his students studied the moon and the stars using wonderful instruments. This practice brought my mother back, at least in my own mind. She, too, would also converse with the moon. As a result of this course of events, although I was considered close to a barbarian because of my place of birth and destitute circumstances, I came to have a knowledge of the most divine of the sciences, something that paved the way for my greatest achievements. After several years living on this island of Ven, I finally desired to return to my native land. Because of the scientific knowledge I had acquired, I assumed it would not be difficult for me to get some degree of honor in my own nation of unskilled men. I requested and got permission from my patron to leave, bade him farewell, and arrived in Copenhagen. Due to my familiarity with their language and country, my fellow travelers readily took me under their wing. I returned home 5 years later. My first source of joy was to find that my mother was still alive and carrying on with the same occupations as before. Seeing me alive and important put an end to her continuous grieving for having abandoned her son in a fit of anger. Autumn was approaching, followed by those long nights of ours. During December, the sun appears just briefly at noon, only to immediately hide again from view. My mother was always with me now that she no longer worked and would never leave me, no matter where I went. Due to the letters of recommendation I had in my possession, I was questioned about the lands I had visited, and even on issues relating to the heavens. My mother took pride in comparing the knowledge I had accumulated with what she herself had discovered as true, and said she could now die, since she was leaving behind an heir to all that science, which was all she had. By nature, I had a real thirst to learn new things. So I questioned my mother about her art and which teachers in the country stood out above the rest. Then one day, when she finally desired to talk, she proceeded to tell me everything she knew from the start. "Deracotus, my child, one can glean knowledge not only in those regions where you have traveled, but also in our own homeland. You have made me understand the charm of other regions. But despite the cold, darkness, and other discomforts which I now feel oppress us, in our country there are still many people with talent. Among us there are spirits who reject the greater light of other regions and the noisy chatter of their men, and seek out our shaded areas to chat intimately with us. Of these spirits, 9 were the most outstanding. One of these in particular, a most gentle and innocent spirit, was known to me and was evoked by 21 characters. Often, in a fraction of a second, I was sent by his power to other shores of my choosing. I could not go somewhere due to the distance. I made up for this by questioning him about those places as if we were there. Many of the things you saw with your own eyes, Hertz said, or absorbed them from your books, he told me, as you yourself have done. In particular, I wish to take you to visit a region about which he has spoken to me so often, one filled with very notable things." The place my mother mentioned was called Lavania. I hastily agreed that she should summon her great teacher. I sat down, ready to listen to both the travel plan and the description of the region where spring had already arrived. The crescent began to shine as soon as the sun hid under the horizon, joining the planet Saturn in the sign of Taurus. My mother went to the nearest crossroad and screamed, uttering a few words and sending her request. Later, she completed the ceremony, returned and demanded silence with the palm of her right hand extended, and sat close to me. No sooner had we tucked our heads under a cloth, as was customary, when a raspy and unrecognizable voice arose and immediately began to speak in this way in the Icelandic language. The Demon of Lavania. 50,000 German miles up in the ether lies the island of Lavania. The route to this island from our land, and vice versa, is rarely open, but when it is accessible, it is easy for us. However, the transport of men is difficult and presents a danger to their lives. We do not accept men who are sedentary, corpulent, or whimsical on our expeditions. Rather, we prefer those who spend their time riding fast horses with persistence, or those who frequently sail to the Indies, who are accustomed to surviving on 2 meals of bread, garlic, dried fish, and other unpleasant dishes a day. There are lean, elderly women who are particularly suited for our purposes. The reason for this is well known. From early childhood they are used to riding male goats, tridents, and travelling across the vast expanse of the land. Although Germans are not suitable, we do not reject the firm bodies of Spaniards. While the route is long, we complete it in just 4 hours. We are always very busy and agree not to leave until the moon starts its eclipse in its easternmost sector. If there is a full moon when we are still en route, our return journey becomes impossible. Since the trip is of such short duration, we only take a few people, and only those who are most devoted to us. We choose a few of these men and, after forming a group with them, push them up toward the heights. The initial shock is the worst part for them, since they are launched upward as if by an explosion and fly over mountains and seas. Therefore, they must be drugged with narcotics and opioids before the flight. In addition, their limbs must be carefully protected so that the torso is not separated from the buttocks or the head from the body, thus ensuring that recoil expands equally through each limb. Then new challenges arise. The intense cold and ever greater difficulty breathing. Relief from the cold comes in the form of an innate ability to withstand low temperatures. We breathe by placing soaked sponges on our nostrils. Once we have completed the first section of the crossing, our trip becomes easier. We expose them to the air and remove our hands. All wrapped up like spiders, they form balls that we guide almost entirely by our own will, so that their masses move freely toward their place of arrival. But this movement is of little use to us, since it is too late. For this reason, we speed up under the force of gravity and go ahead of the bodies of men, lest they sustain some injury as a result of a very strong impact on the moon. When the people awake, they usually complain that all of their limbs suffer an ineffable lassitude, which, however, disappears completely once the effect of the drugs wears off and they can walk again. Many other difficulties arise during the trip, which would take too long to list. On the other hand, nothing bad happens to us, since as a group we live in the shadows of the earth, no matter how long they are. When these men arrive at Lavania, here we are, as if we had disembarked from a ship to earth. After that, we retire quickly to caves and shady places so that the sun does not set while we are in the open and force us to follow shadows on its own withdrawal. This gives us time for leisure activities and to follow our inclinations. We consulted the demons of the province and formed a league. Whenever there is a space with shade, come together and go there. And if the shadows strike earth with their sharp tip, as so often happens, we drag our feet on that land along with our colleagues. We can only do this when men are witnesses of a solar eclipse. This shows that solar eclipses are to be feared. I have already said enough about the trip to Lavania. As geographers so often do, I will now speak about the form of the province itself, beginning with their vision of the sky. The fixed stars look the same in Lavania as on Earth, but the movements and sizes of the planets are very different from those we see from the Earth, so all their astronomy is diverse. Just as geographers divide the globe into 5 zones according to celestial phenomena, Lavania is divided into 2 hemispheres. One of them, the Svolvian, always has a view of the volva, which for them is like our moon. Another, the prevolvian, has no view of volva whatsoever. The circle that divides both hemispheres, comparable to the color of the solstice, passes through the celestial poles, and it's called the splitter. I will first explain what the two hemispheres have in common. Like the Earth, the whole of Lavania is subject to the same succession of day and night, but there are no other changes during the year. Throughout Lavania, days are of almost the same duration as nights, except for the fact that in the prevolvian hemisphere, day is shorter than night, while in the subvolvian day is longer. What alters over the course of an 8-year cycle will be mentioned later. In order to produce the same nights as both poles, the sun is hidden for half the time, while during the other half it shines on its round tip around the mountains. Lavania appears still to its inhabitants, just as our Earth seems to stand still to us. One Earth month is equivalent to one of their nights and one day. When the sun is about to rise early in the morning, a new zodiac sign appears. For us, the sun rotates 365 times in a year, and the orbits of the fixed stars 336 times. Or, to be more precise, in 4 years, the sun rotates 1,461 times, and orbits of the fixed stars 1,465. For them, in a year, the sun rotates around them 12 times, and the sphere of the fixed stars 13. Or, to be more precise, in 8 years, the sun completes 99 revolutions, and the fixed stars 107. However, they are more familiar with a cycle of 19 years, for over this period the sun rises 235 times, and the fixed stars 254 times. The sun rises in the inner and central parts of subvolva when the last quarter of the moon is visible to us. Then, in the middle of the prevolva, when the first quarter is visible to us. The first of these phenomena is made clear by applying semicircles to the poles, with the center at right angles with the splitter. These are known as the medivolvian semicircles. The intermediate circle between the poles, which produces the same effect as the equator on Earth, has the same name and cuts the splitter in equal parts and the medivolva at opposite points. The sun passes above some places in the equator in 2 opposite days of the year, precisely at noon. For all those who live on both sides of the equator, the sun deviates from the zenith at noon. On Lavania, there is some variation between summer and winter. However, one should not draw comparisons between these two seasons and seasons on Earth, nor do they always occur in the same place at the same time. Over a period of 10 years, summer on Lavania changes from one part of the sidereal year to the opposite side. The reason for this is that in a cycle of 19 stellar years and 235 days, summer and winter occur 20 times near the poles and 40 at the equator. Each year has 6 summer days and 6 winter days, as do our months. This alternation is barely felt around the equator because the sun does not deviate more than 5 degrees on either side. However, the variation is felt much more at the poles and in those places that alternate between 6 months of sunlight and 6 months of darkness, as do some places on Earth. The globe of Lavania is also divided into 5 areas which, to an extent, correspond to the divisions of the Earth, with the exception that its tropical and frigid zones span just 10 degrees each. The remainder is equivalent to our temperate zone. The tropical zone goes through the center of each hemisphere, with half running through the subvolva and the other half through the prevolva. The intersection of equatorial and zodiacal circles creates 4 corners in the manner of our equinoxes and solstices. These sections give birth to the zodiacal circle. However, from the outset, fixed stars move at a very rapid rate over 20 tropical years, defined as a summer and a winter. On Earth, fixed stars go through the full zodiac every 26,000 years. So far, this is what concerns the first movement. The theory of secondary movements is no less different for them than it is for us, albeit much more intricate. The reason is that in addition to the many irregularities shown by the 6 planets, Jupiter, Mars, Saturn, the Sun, Venus, and Mercury, they witness 3 more. 2 of them are in length, one daily, the second over a period of 8.5 years, and the third of latitude over a 19-year cycle. Middle Prevolvians see the sun larger at noon than when it rises, while Subvolvians see it smaller than when it rises. Both believe that the sun inclines towards subvolva for a few minutes, back and forth from the ecliptic, and then among the fixed stars. As I have said, these oscillations go back to the starting point in a period of 19 years. Even so, this variation takes longer in the prevolva and somewhat less time in the subvolva. And while there is an assumption that the sun and the fixed stars advance evenly around Lavania in its first movement, the sun in fact hardly moves in relation to the stars for the prevolva at noon, and appears to move very quickly for the subvolva, while at midnight the opposite is true. As a result, the sun seems to give daily jumps among the stars. The same is true in the case of Venus, Mercury, and Mars. These phenomena are almost imperceptible for Jupiter and Saturn. In addition, the daily movement is not uniform every day at similar hours. On the contrary, it is sometimes slower not only for the sun, but also for the fixed stars, and becomes faster in the opposite part of the year at the same time. Moreover, this delay changes during the year, in such a manner that it now takes place on a summer's day and then on a winter's day, completing the cycle in less than 9 years. Hence, the day becomes sometimes longer than the night, because of a natural slowness, not, as is the case on Earth, due to an uneven section of the orbit on a calendar day, and sometimes the night becomes longer. But if the delay lies above the prevolva during the night, its excess on the day is increased. If, on the other hand, it happens during the day, then night and day are more evenly matched, something that only happens completely once every 9 years. The opposite is true for the subvolva. So far, I have explained the common characteristics to both hemispheres. The Prevolvian Hemisphere. There is great contrast between each hemisphere. By its presence or absence, volva gives rise to very dissimilar spectacles. Moreover, the effects of phenomena common to both hemispheres differ greatly in the 2 hemispheres. As a result, one could perhaps more correctly call the Prevolvian Hemisphere intemperate and the Subvolvian temperate. Nights in Prevolva last for 15 or 16 Earth days, and are terrible for their endless shadows, like nights on Earth with no moon. Not even the rays of volva reach Prevolvia. As a result, everything turns to hard ice and spray and is subject to the most powerful and fearsome winds. This is followed by the day, which is the equivalent of 14 Earth days or a little less. During this time, the sun appears quite large and moves slowly in relation to the fixed stars. There are no winds. As a result, the heat becomes unbearable. Thus, within a period equal to 1 month on Earth or 1 day in Lavania, a given place is exposed to a heat 15 times more intense than that experienced in Africa, and a cold more unbearable than that of the Quivira. It should be noted in particular that the planet Mars sometimes appears almost twice as large as it does from Earth. This is the case for those who live in the central parts of the pre-vulva at midnight, while for people living elsewhere on pre-vulva it occurs at the beginning of their own night. The subvolvian hemisphere. As we move into this hemisphere, I will start with the frontiersmen, those who inhabit the dividing circle. These people are unique in that to them, the observed digressions of Venus and Mercury with respect to the Sun seem much greater than to us. To them, Venus appears to be twice as large or larger as it does to us on Earth, especially to those who live near the North Pole. However, the most pleasant of the visions in Livonia is the contemplation of vulva. People living in the subvolvian hemisphere have a view of vulva instead of our moon, which is invisible to both the subvolvians and prevulvians. Due to the perennial presence of vulva in its skies, this region is called subvulva, while the other one is called prevulva because it has no view of vulva. When there is a full moon and travels over houses and distant mountains, it appears to the inhabitants of the earth as the circle of a large wooden barrel. When it rises to the middle of the sky, it brings to mind something resembling the shape of a human face. But when vulva appears at the middle of the sky, vulva takes this position for those who live in the center of this hemisphere, it has a diameter that is slightly less than 4 times more that of our moon. Therefore, if we compare these two bodies, the surface of vulva is 15 times greater than that of our moon. For those for whom vulva continually appears on the horizon, it appears in the form of a distant burning mountain. Just as we tell our regions apart according to their higher or lower altitudes in relation to the pole, even though we do not necessarily see the pole with our own eyes, so the altitude of this ever-present vulva serves the same purpose for subvolvians, as it is always visible and varies in altitude in different places. While, as I have said, vulva hangs directly overhead for some of them, it seems to have been pulled down close to the circle of the horizon everywhere else, and for the remaining regions, its altitude differs between the zenith and horizon and is always constant. That said, subvolvians have their own poles that are not among the fixed stars, where we have our own poles, but around other fixed stars which to us point to the poles of the ecliptics. In 19 lunar years, these poles cross small circles around the poles of the ecliptic in the constellation of Draco and their opposites, Cepheus, Golden, and Passer, Piscis Austrinus, and the Great Nebula. Since these poles are close to a quadrant of vulva, their regions can be classified according to the poles and the relation to vulva, resulting in an obvious advantage for them over us in this respect. They indicate places in relation to their stationary vulva and latitude both according to their vulva and the poles. For us it's different, as there is no way for us to determine distance except via the serval tilting of a hardly distinguishable magnetic needle. Subvolvian's vulva remains stationary, as if nailed to the heavens. Above it, other celestial bodies and the sun itself cross from east to west. There is no night, none of the fixed stars in the zodiac will not hide behind this vulva and once again emerge in the opposite region. Although not the same, fixed stars and all those stars that lie 6 or 7 degrees from the ecliptic also do this every night. In 19 years, the entire circuit is completed and each star returns to its original position. In addition, vulva also does not increase in size more or less than our moon. The same cause exists for both causes, the presence of the sun or its departure. Its duration is also the same according to nature, but we on Earth and the subvolvians measure it using different methods. Subvolvians consider a day and a night the span of time during which all increases and decreases in the image of vulva are completed. We call this period of time a month. Because of its size and brightness, Volva is rarely hidden from the subvolvians, even in new Volva, in particular in the case of polar inhabitants for whom the sun is invisible at the time. For them, Volva rotates its horns upwards at noon in what is known as the intervolvian period. In general, for those who live between Volva and the poles below the medivolvian circle, the new Volva is the signal of noon, the first quarter of night, the full Volva of midnight, and the last quarter brings the sun back. Those who observe Volva and the poles located on the horizon live at the intersection of the equator with the splitter, and Volva can be seen in full in the morning and evening, with 1/4 of Volva visible at noon and midnight. From these observations, we can draw conclusions about those who live among these places described above. Subvolvians tell the time using these and other phases of Volva. For example, the closer they are to the sun and Volva, the nearer noon is for the medivolvians, and night or sunset for those who live close to the equator. Subvolvians are much better equipped than we are to measure periods of night, which regularly last 14 hours, since in addition to that sequence of phases of Volva, a full Volva marks the middle of the night for the medivolva, Volva itself is used to tell the time. Although Volva does not seem to move, unlike our moon, it rotates and shows a surprising number of marks and points that are constantly changing from east to west. When one of these marks returns after one of these revolutions, subvolvians consider an hour to have passed, equivalent to a little more than one of our days and nights. This is the only uniform measure of time since, as we have indicated previously, the sun and the stars rotate daily around these lunar bodies in an irregular manner. This lack of uniformity is clearly revealed by the rotation of Volva when compared to the distances of the stars to the moon. The upper section of North Volva seems to have two halves, one that is rather hidden, as if covered with continuous marks, and the other somewhat more clear, interpenetrated by a bright belt up north that serves as a dividing line between the two. The dark half is hard to explain. However, in its easternmost section we perceive something as the front of a human head, cut off by the shoulders, bending to kiss a girl dressed in a long robe, while the arm is extended backwards to try to capture a jumping cat. The wider and larger part faces west with no recognizable form. In the other half of Volva, brightness extends more widely than the mark itself. It could be described as the image of a bell hanging from a rope and swaying towards the west. The upper and lower parts cannot be compared to anything. Besides allowing subvolvians to tell the time in this manner, Volva provides them with a clear indication of the seasons of the year if they are paying close attention, or if the observer is unfamiliar with the fixed stars. Even when the sun passes through Cancer, Volva clearly indicates the north pole of its rotation. There is a small dark spot above the image of the girl, above the bright area. From the highest and most remote part of Volva, this point will move to the east. From there, as it descends on the disk, it moves westward. The marks withdraw once again from the last position towards the east, towards the top of the Volva, and thus are always visible. But when the sun enters Capricorn, it cannot be seen, since the entire circle with its pole is hidden behind Volva. During these two periods of the year, the points move linearly to the west. During intermediate periods of Aries and Libra, these points sink across or climb in a crooked line. This fact shows us that while the center of Volva remains at rest, the poles of this rotation revolve in an arctic circle around the poles of the lunar inhabitants once a year. The most diligent observers are also aware that Volva is not always the same size. During the hours of the day in which heavenly bodies move quickly, the diameter of Volva is much bigger, well over 4 times as large as our moon. What can be said now about the eclipses of the sun and Volva? Lavania's eclipses occur at the same time as eclipses of the sun and the moon are seen here on Earth, but obviously for opposite reasons. When we see a total eclipse of the sun, their vulva is overshadowed. When we have a lunar eclipse, Lavania experiences a solar eclipse. Even so, this correspondence is not absolute. Lavania often experiences partial solar eclipses when a part of the moon is hidden to us. On the other hand, it often does not experience eclipses of vulva when we have partial eclipses of the sun. Lavania experiences total eclipses of vulva in full vulva, just as we have our moon eclipses in full moon. They have new vulva eclipses of sun, as we have ours in new moon. Since they have long days and nights, it experiences more frequent eclipses of both celestial bodies, and as well as a large number of our eclipses occur in our antipodes, their antipodes do not witness any eclipses, since they are prevolvians, while subvolvians see them all. Subvolvians never see a total eclipse of vulva, but a small reddish-brown point in its outline and dark in the middle crosses over them through the body of vulva. This small spot makes its entrance in the eastern section of vulva and disappears through the western edge, just as the neutral points of vulva, but surpassing them in haste. This spot lasts 1/6 of one Lavania hour, or 4 Earth hours. The cause of their solar eclipse is vulva, as our moon is the cause of ours. Given that vulva measures 4 times the size of the sun, this phenomenon is inevitable. While the sun crosses from the east through the south past vulva, on its journey westwards it often remains hidden behind vulva. Although such disappearances are frequent, it is equally remarkable that it lasts several hours and that both the sun and vulva are in the shade at the same time. This is a great spectacle for subvolvians, whose nights are usually not much darker than their days due to the brightness and magnitude of their omnipresent vulva, while during the eclipse of the sun both celestial bodies, the sun and vulva, remain hidden. Even so, their solar eclipses have the following peculiar feature. Often, as soon as vulva is hidden behind the sun, a brightness rises on the opposite side, as if the sun had expanded and embraced the whole of vulva, while at other times the sun seems much less voluminous than vulva. As a result, complete darkness does not always ensue until the centers of the bodies coincide closely and the condition of the half-transparent medium is adequate. Nor, on the other hand, does vulva disappear suddenly so that it cannot be discerned at all. Even though the sun sets completely behind it, the only exception occurs at the intermediate time of a total eclipse. At the beginning of such an eclipse, however, vulva continues to be white in some sections of the splitter, rather like a coal once the flame has been extinguished. After this whiteness disappears, the midpoint of the total eclipse has been reached, since it only disappears completely during this type of eclipse. When the whiteness of vulva returns, in opposite places of the splitter of the circle, the sun is closer to be seen. Thus, both bodies disappear in the middle of the total eclipse. These are the phenomena that occur in the 2 hemispheres of Lavania, the subvolvian and the prevolvian. In view of these considerations, it is not difficult to give an opinion how subvolvians and prevolvians differ in many aspects. Although it lasts 14 of our nights, a subvolvian night lights up the surface and protects it from the cold due to the presence of vulva. A large, luminous mass like that cannot but keep the surface hot. On the other hand, although the subvolvian day has the annoying presence of the sun for 15 or 16 of our days and nights, the sun over subvolvia is smaller and less powerful. The combined celestial bodies attract all the water to this hemisphere until the surface is completely covered, so very little of it stands out. However, when the water is removed from the prevolvian hemisphere, it becomes dry and cold. However, when night begins for subvolvians and day for prevolvians, the celestial bodies are divided between both hemispheres, and so water is divided. Subvolvian fields dry up, while water brings some respite from the heat for prevolvians. The whole of Livonia has a circumference of no more than 1,400 German miles, a quarter of that of the earth. It has very high mountains and very deep and wide valleys, and, as a result, bears no comparison to the earth, with its perfect roundness. The entire surface is porous, as if bored through hollow caverns and caves. In particular, throughout the prevolvian hemisphere, these hollow places are the main way for prevolvians to protect themselves against the heat and cold. Everything that springs from their land or treads on it is of a monstrous size. Living beings increase in size at a very rapid rate, and life is short because all living things have huge body masses. Prevolvians have no fixed dwelling or home. In the space of a single day, they go across their entire world in hordes, following their receding warders, using their legs, which are longer than those of a camel, or using wings or boats. Should several days of travel be in order, they creep through the caves, depending on the nature of each cave. Most of them are divers, and they all breathe very slowly. They can take refuge in the bottom of the deep waters, combining nature with art. It is said that those who are in the depths of the water stand the cold, while water on the surface steams as a result of the sun. Those that remain on the surface are boiled by the midday sun and serve as food for the hordes of errant settlers. In general, the subvolvian hemisphere can be compared to our cantons, towns, and gardens, while the prevolvian hemisphere is similar to our fields, forests, and deserts. Those for whom breathing is essential take refuge in caves, where the supply of water is guaranteed by narrow channels that allow water to be cooled gradually during its long-distance voyage, and use it for drinking. But when night comes, they go out for food. Tree bark, the skin of living beings, or anything else which takes its place, occupy most of their corporal mass, and it is porous and spongy. If any being is surprised by the heat of the day, its skin becomes hard and scorched and falls off at night. Everything that springs out from the soil on the mountain tops grows and dies on the same day, making daily space for it to be replaced by new beings. In general, a serpentine nature is predominant. Serpents expose themselves to the sun at noon, but always near the mouths of their caves, so that they can retreat quickly and safely. For some, the courage they have exhausted and the life that they have lost as a result of the daytime heat return in the evening as an opposite pattern to that which flies show here on earth. Here and there are scattered masses in the shape of pine cones. Their bark is fired by the sun during the day, but at night, when they reveal their secrets, a multitude of living things come out of the hiding place these cones provide. In the subvolvian hemisphere, the clouds and storms provide a special form of relief from the heat that often takes over half or more of the region. When I got to this part of my dream, the wind rose with a noisy rain that disrupted my rest and, at the same time, deleted the end of one of the last books that I bought from Frankfurt. Therefore, leaving behind the demon, the speaker, and Duracotus, the son with his mother, Volkshilde, the listeners, at the point in which their heads had been covered, I returned to my senses, only to find that my head was on a pad and my body wrapped in a blanket. You have been listening to Somnium, the Dream, written by Johannes Kepler, and read for you